Welcome to the second episode of the Ancient Egyptian History series. In it, I will talk about prehistoric times. The term prehistory is a flexible term that usually refers to all the ancient times that preceded the knowledge of writing, the formation of the globe, and settled life. We can call it silent history. In another expression, somewhat synonymous with the Stone Age, but in my personal opinion, it is a slightly more advanced expression because primitive man at that time was forced to make something with his own hands, stone tools that fit his limited demands at the time, which were at least self-defense, in the world of survival of the fittest. If this is the first time you hear me, I am Kholoud El-Gammal, PhD. I am Kholoud El-Gammal, PhD in Egyptian Antiquities. I hope you support me by subscribing, liking, and sharing if you like the verse. We will start our episode with the question, how did we know prehistory? Even though it is a silent and unwritten history, the truth is that prehistoric times, despite the many studies on them, are still times full of speculation and mystery, and differences of opinion among researchers and scientists. These ages are a matter of great controversy. But the sources they relied on for dating were radiocarbon dating, thermal variability, pottery dating, tree ring dating, bone study, tool development, and others. Some of the artifacts that were found are modest and will not satisfy anyone except specialists, because they are the ones concerned with studying them. But despite the modesty of these tools and their slow development, they tell of the suffering of the first man who faced the brutality of the ancient environment and the tyranny of creatures. Experts divided prehistoric ages into three sections. The Lower Paleolithic or First Paleolithic Age, a very long era, a rainy glacial period with different theories about its beginning in time. People of this era used hand tools and primitive tools made of stones to defend themselves from animals or humans. Use it to hunt animals, cut their meat, bones, and bring down tree fruits. A cave dweller, wandering and searching for food. And escape from dangers. At the end of this era, somewhere in the ancient world, and most likely by chance, fire was discovered, and this was the first material revolution in the history of human civilization. Simply because human food was cooked after being separated from animal food, he began to use fire to resist cold and frost. He had somewhat overcome his fears of the dark of night, and his wildness was certainly lessened, and he shook his form after he had gotten rid of the effort of eating raw food. To start a new era, the Middle Stone Age, a long period of the rainy era. The tools were a little different from the previous era. They began to refine them by scraping and sharpening their edges like blades and thorns. The first Egyptian preferred to wander between the deserts, plateaus and highlands around him, looking for sources, food and drink. For the Upper Paleolithic period to begin, heavy rains ended and were replaced by drought. The savanna plants diminished, and consequently the large animals that fed on them diminished. There was no water, no plants, some animals became extinct, and some migrated from one place, and drought conditions continued to prevail little by little. At that time, man began to try to develop his tools due to his new living conditions. He set the massive stone tools. He began making small tools to hunt small animals that were still alive and resistant to drought. Arrows, bows, and fixed weapons fixed to tree branches served the purpose instead of heavy stone tools at the end of the Upper Paleolithic. Because of the severe drought, the first Egyptians began to follow the spread of plants and grains to the permanent resource in their land, the Nile River. Successive waves began to gather and the security encouraged them to settle down when their stay was unusually long in order to enjoy the natural vegetation. Fish, animals, and water. All around the Nile. They began to notice the growth of plants in the fertile lands, of course after they saw the effect of the flood and its decline, and that plants grow automatically after the black soil becomes available until generation after generation understood it, whether the period was long or short. In the end, they learned the methods of agriculture. Of course, my knowledge of agriculture had social, urban and economic consequences, and not only in Egypt. Family cohesion appeared among individuals. The father was in need, the effort of his children and wife in agriculture and the farmers. They gathered next to their farm. There was a religion of cooperation and gathering to protect themselves from the dangers of flooding, and they began to dig what we can say passages and drainages for the flood. In addition to agriculture, animals were domesticated and they made agricultural tools, such as bows, sickles, baskets of wicker, papyrus and esparto to store grain. They also began to make mats. Of course, these industries were gradual, not at the same time. Coincidence, observation, patience, and finally necessity are the mother of invention. Of course, the traces of the first Egyptian in his 3 appearances are found in different areas, and scientists named them after these places. Hadrat al-Fayoum, Baramlat Bani Salama, Hadrat al-Badari, Deir Tassa, al-Wahat al-Karga, Hadik Mambo, and in the foothills of the Luxor Highlands and near Aswan, Helwan. On the roads of the oases, Dashur in Saqqara, traces of the first man are present, dating back to the 3 Stone Ages. After settling in the Nile Valley, he knew that clay could be used to make pottery after burning it, and he learned about pottery. He knew the properties of pottery by chance after it was reddened under the fire, or he noticed prayer due to the heat of the sun. The important thing is that the industry began manually for a long time. When he was able to satisfy his desire and aspirations, the childhood stage of art began. Small statues of clay, bones, ivory, human form, animal. The proportions are not important, nor the degree of mastery. The legs are attached, a large head, formations, shapes from the environment, primitive drawings that preserve the shape of animals, like the cave of swimmers. The important thing is that this primitive childhood art, despite its modesty, is evidence of the beginning of the first Egyptian reconciliation with the environment. We still have time for art. Scientists called the era of knowledge of agriculture the Neolithic, and the truth is that there are many names, and only specialists know them. The important thing is that the stage of new stone tools, production, and control of the land, all of this is reasonable. If we talk about the first Egyptian form as races and genera, then the remains of skeletons appeared in the Taramsa Hill in Cana Governorate. The remains of a child were found, estimated to be about 70,000 years old. It was found by a mission from the University of Leuven in Belgium. Anatomical features. The features according to scientists are the same as those of the present Egyptian. In the city of Tata in Sohag in 1980, the skeleton of a young man in his 20s was found, called the Nazlet Kater man, estimated to be about 35,000 years old, about 160 centimeters tall, not a giant. Of course, these dates raise the question of the beginning of prehistoric times. In my personal opinion, the chronology needs to be reviewed. Honey on the Mountain Man, or gingerbread man mummy. He was called that because of his hair color and appearance. Amaya is placed in a fetal position in her grave. Deep. It was naturally mummified due to the nature of the climate and dry sand. This was one of the burial methods in the ancient times. The deceased was placed in a squatting position, surrounded by some pottery tools. Of course, burial methods are between a small hole in which the deceased is placed on one side, or in a sitting position, but the idea has developed over the ages and differed from one place to another. The big civilizational step after that was the knowledge of metals, and their use after copper was one of the first metals to be discovered, because it is present and close to the surface, and mixed with some materials that are easily melted, and most likely this discovery was by chance. Of course, this era had many names: the beginning of metals, the Copper Age, and the Stone Age. The important thing is that it was the era in which metals began to be used on a small scale, for decorative purposes, long spears, and pins for leather clothes. Of course, this talk was accompanied by spherical formations and primitive societies that were reassured by mud and dry grasses. Irregular buildings of doubt, and then rectangular buildings. The ball began to be distant. But from time to time there was contact to ward off danger or kinship ties of common interests, and sometimes a strong ball would try to control a weak ball that had more space or production, or to achieve leadership. To begin the dawn of history.